Fundamentals of Mixing, Lesson 8. We've already gone through a series of lessons here for pre-mix preparation, mostly focusing on some of the basics with speaker setup, getting through some of your own tuning. One of the things I want to be clear about, and maybe I didn't make this so clear in terms of tuning yourself, because when you actually focus on setting up your room and getting the speakers set correctly and doing all of that sort of stuff, getting everything dialed in so that you can hear the 3D sound field as well as you can. You can do frequency sweeping and testing as long as as the treatments you do don't mess up the imaging of the speakers. Very, very important that you preserve the imaging of the speakers. And as you kind of balance things out, one of the things that you'll want to do before you really start mixing is to get an assessment or make an assessment of how you're hearing on that particular day. And the thing that's always a good thing to do is to have some music, stuff that that sounds good, mixes that you like, artists that you like, and just listen to that music. It's always good to have something kind of playing in the background, even if it's at a low level while you're working, because what happens is you get a bit of a self-calibration. At first, it may seem like things are bright or dark or warm or whatever, based on, what you've gone through up to that particular point in the day. But when you do that, your brain will start to self-calibrate around what it is that you're hearing. So when you actually start mixing and calling up your tracks and getting to work, then you'll have a better sort of mindset. Your brain and your ears will be kind of tuned for working. And those references are become important as breaks between things that you're doing. So we'll talk about reference mixes in a separate lesson, which I've already talked about a little bit, and also talk about some mix mapping. But what we're going to focus on right here is pre-mix preparation and evaluating tracks. So in track evaluation, what we really want to do is we want to break down tracks into different categories. So as we're listening to a production, so I have this production up here. Let me just kind of maybe set all my tracks here, set things up so we can see the waveform a little bit better. What we have is a production that's about a little over 30 tracks, maybe 32 tracks or so. It's a dance production, sort of a kind of almost a bit of a vintage disco kind of vibe to it. And so we're going to kind of play with some of that. And there's some, some EDM effects and some reverse effects that are a little bit outside of the vintage disco kind of category. But there's some really cool things I think to work with here. And so, we're gonna dial some of this stuff in and kind of play around with some things here. And I wanted to focus on going through track organization and things like that. But the track analysis is really important. Track analysis involves a number of different aspects of the sound. One is determining what the role of a particular part or audio track is in the production. In other words, is it a primary part? Is it the thread of the track? Meaning, is it the part that kind of runs through from beginning to end that drives the whole track? Is it a lead part? Is it a background part? Is it a rhythmic part? Does it primarily have, rhythm as its value, chord changes, melodic movement? What aspect of the production is this particularly dealing with? And then you have to kind of devise and figure out how it is that you want to place and kind of work with all of these things. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to back down on some of this stuff. I'm going to open up some comments here. And then what we could do is we can make some notes as we kind of go along. Now, you don't have to do this, but essentially what I wanted to do here was to give you an idea of how this basic process works. Now, in general, the only time I usually take notes on something if there's something in particular that I want to remember. And usually it's something where I notice a particular thing, maybe a problem, which is what it is most of the time, and maybe I don't want to deal with it at that particular time. And what I find is that I have like a dozen pads on my desk all the time. I'm an old analog guy who always writes things down on pads and takes notes. And then I end up with so many pads that they end up all a mess in a pile, and then I lose them, and then I never look at the lists and stuff. But when you put it in the comment section, it's just always there. It's saved with the session. You don't lose it. It doesn't get, tucked under, your grocery list for the store or anything like that and lost. So I wanted to kind of go through this. So let's start, because I had like a very basic, very, very basic, rough mix here. Most of this stuff is just monoed up except for where it's stereo. And just to give you an idea of what the full production sounds like.
It's enlightening who we are. Don't have a manual, but together we can use a star. We are standing just feet apart, not recognizing the reflection of a superstar. When your legs start to give up on you, still run the race. Yeah, it's just what we have to do to just claim the fame. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting who you are, that's stopping. Ain't no stopping, ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting who you are, that's stopping. Ain't no stopping, ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting who you are, that's stopping. Ain't no stopping, ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Realizing what we are, we're full of passion.
Okay, I think you get the basic idea of it. So that's the basic flow. Now everything is dry. There's no effects. There's nothing. So I'm kind of bringing this in all from fresh. And I kind of want to start with some of the basics here, so we can kind of understand what's going on. Now, fundamentally, if we just do a visual on the track, you could see that the bass kind of starts and stops through the beginning, plays through the choruses. I'm going to redo these in a little while. And kind of starts and stops through the verses and stuff like that. So it plays not necessarily a big role in the song except for the chorus section, which you could see here. You can see there's also some drum loops that kind of primarily run through the chorus sections, so that becomes an important thing. There's another drum thing here. I'm not sure if that's percussion or exactly what that is. All right, so that's a loop that kind of plays through. But the one element that you'll notice that kind of drives through all of this is the kick drum. The kick drum pretty much drives through everything except for the intro and a short break there. And it pretty much runs uninterrupted all the way through. We have some snare at times, reverse snare, which is filling in some reverse elements at different parts of the snare drum, stick. You can see there's some hand claps. Those usually tie together nicely with the snare drum, right? Because they're pretty much following along that same backbeat kind of thing. Some hi-hat tracks. There's nothing else that really drives all the way through except for maybe this main guitar. And then the next closest thing might be the keys, this pad here, but that's not like, but that's also not playing in the intro, and it disappears in some breakdown sections. So when focusing on this, and the reason why I kind of go through this a little bit meticulously like this, is that one of the things that I've found with all mixes is that they tend to balance or hinge off of some fundamental element that typically runs through the song. Sometimes that's a piano, and meaning that the piano track, maybe it's like you could almost separate the song and have it be vocal piano, and it would be almost a complete song. Sometimes it's a guitar, like an acoustic guitar or something like that. That you find that quite a lot in more artist singer-songwriter type of artists and things like that, where they're working with a singular instrument and performing, and then they build a band that kind of responds to whatever that person is doing, and usually that person plays. So for almost all of like Elton John's tracks, it's piano vocal, right? That's sort of the centerpiece. And the productions are typically built around those types of things. Meaning that if you've ever heard of like a top-down mix, a top-down mix is a mix where you start with the vocal and you work your way down through the other instruments. And the way most other people structure their mixes is they start from kick, snare, drums, and percussion, and then they work their way through bass and guitars and all that sort of stuff, and then kind of slowly wind their way from the main rhythm instruments all the way back up to the vocal. And quite often the vocal is the last thing or one of the last things in. Now, there are many different methods and many different ways of working. And you have to kind of understand that there is no one method that is really perfect for every song and for everybody. And the reason why I created this is that in putting something together like this and starting a mix, I always like to know what is kind of the element or the sound that everything else responds to. And that's almost always something that runs through the whole song. So in other words, if I had a piano part that was running from beginning to end of the song, then all the guitar parts that come in the verse are going to be based off of that foundation of the piano part. And if there's a Rhodes that comes in the chorus, that based off the piano part. And everything kind of goes off that. Now, there are tracks where the shaker is that part. In a disco track, quite often and very often, it's the kick drum, because the kick drum is really that one element. It's that pulse on the floor, and it drives the whole purpose of the song. The idea being it's like to get people out onto the dance floor, right? And so the only other competing element in this would be the guitar track. So if we actually played this and soloed this, the guitar track, and then we picked up and played the lead vocal,
Who we are.
we'd basically have the foundation of the
Together
song.
we can use a start. We are standing just feet apart, not recognizing the reflection of a superstar. When your legs start to give up on you, still run the race.
Now, this doesn't mean, when I say the thread, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's that the song would stand on its own, because not all songs are structured and designed that way. But in this case, I would say that those are the two primary elements of the song that are going to fundamentally drive the groove and the rhythm of the track. And so those end up being, the key star points in all of this. And then, of course, as we start to wind and bring in other elements, they all play a role. So if I started with that kick drum, and let's see, I think I made a selection here. Now, because these parts don't kind of play through the whole track, if I feature them too much over the kick drum, what happens is the whole intensity of the track disappears. So here, by looking at this, if I kind of analyze a lot of the driving aspects of the track here, like the claps are also a key element here, more so than the snare drum is. So even that snare drum that's there is only a backdrop. It's only a backdrop to the clap. It's just filling in kind of what's missing from the claps. And then the reverse snare. And there's some work that we're going to have to do on that kick drum to get that really solid. But you could see how this becomes a really important element for the rest of the song. Hold on. I think we have all right. Hold on one second here. We have a breakdown here. Okay, there was a quick technical glitch there. So back from that. Okay, so in listening to this, as I start to put together some basics, I'm doing a little bit of level and and basic foundational stuff, but it's really analyzing the tracks. There's another aspect to this, and maybe what I'll do is I'll kind of continue on here a little bit because I've kind of brought in some elements here, and sometimes in cases like this, it might just be easier to kind of mute things as I go along. Oops. So I'm playing with some levels here on the work surface. And so we'll kind of key into some things as they come along here. Let's just see, because and then there's also, so I'm also going to line up and kind of bring in some other tracks here. So there's a lot of stuff that sort of leans on that backbeat that changes around at different times. We got a rim shot here. So right now I'm down here, I'm listening to this, and so I'm just going to put these guys together here. And that's not necessarily like the key positioning here, but I want to get an idea of like of what some of these, let me just see here what that is crash. So like one thing here I'm just going to make a quick note of is the sustain cuts off, right? So so I'm going to have to probably supplement that with some kind of a reverb or replace it. We'll see how that kind of plays out. Yeah, it just has like a cutoff. Could probably get away with that for most of the stuff. And then there are some, looks like there's some effects tracks. So we have some things here like reverse kick. And then, and that I guess is probably supplemented by this effect. All right, so that's probably going to need some kind of verbed out effect on it. Let's see. All right, so we got some kind of, what do they call that now? Like, as a riser goes up. So is that a downer? A faller? It's a fall. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's like a... Should have been very obvious. That's what happens when you hire old people to mix your songs. And then... Wouldn't be a party without sirens. Right, so you got like plenty of interesting kind of elements in here. Let's just see if I can find. That's old school. But funky, man. So of these two guitar parts, when we're getting to the rhythm section, this is really the most important one. One, because it plays through more of the song. It also defines the chord changes more clearly. It's a nice funky part. It has like all the harmonic and rhythmic content. So this is a really, really important part. This along with the bass and then the kick driving that pulse. Where this is more rhythmic, even though there's some chords here and there and some notes. It's not doing anything melodic. It's purely like a rhythmic. It's almost more of a percussive element in a way. And that's important because, you know, if I'm mixing with this or working with this, sometimes this will pair up with another element. In the percussive side of things. And this is the reason why I mentioned some of this stuff. Like a classic thing might be something like the hi-hat. And it doesn't really play off of that so much, but let's just see. But when you get to that, when you get to some of that with the hi-hat, let's see if I can find the hi-hats. So in listening to this, I want to kind of figure out like what elements really play off of each other. What elements connect with each other on some level, because that's going to determine pan positioning. Like sometimes, like a very common thing, like sometimes when you see a shaker in a track, it's doing something very similar to the hi-hat. A lot of times what ends up happening in those types of cases is that the drummer, maybe they're just not good with the hi-hat, so they weren't crisp and clean and tight. And so the shaker is placed in the part as a way almost of either A, masking the horrible hi-hat performance or horrible hi-hat skills of the drummer, or it's meant to kind of, you know, maybe propel a rhythm where the hi-hat is not really quite filling that role. And it may either find itself in the exact same pan position as the hi-hat, more or less masking it, and therefore you're kind of covering up the poor performance. Or if the hi-hat performance is really good and the shaker part plays off of it, then you move it to the opposite side. So if you pan the hi-hat left, move the shaker over to the right, and then what you get is this left-right interplay, which helps to create groove, right? So you have elements that are kind of fundamentally responding to each other in some way. Okay, so let's get into some of it. So we have, our primary and secondary parts. There's also some other guitar parts here. Let's just see what these guys are all about. Usually when you see guitar parts that look like they're playing the same thing, there's usually one of two things going on, and sometimes a little analysis here kind of helps to figure out what's happening. Like I can see here just by looking at it that the parts are actually different. Like, so there's some extra bits in here that aren't on the other part. You can see the sustains are different from each other. The reason why I take a look at this is that sometimes you can look at a part. Like, I've actually seen things where somebody mixes a song and they have like two, guitar parts, but it's basically two different mics from the same amp, and they're treating them like they're doubling each other, and then it creates this weird smearing effect, and phase, they're like off in phase, and there's something odd that doesn't quite sit in the track, and they're meant to be blended together. So it's obviously, like, when I look at these two parts, I realize that they're different from each other. And the quick way, of course, is that if you pan them left and right and you listen and the parts are identical to each other, right? So not that it images center, because you may have two different mics, a distant mic, but you could tell if they're playing the same part, because if there's something like off with the rhythm or the sustain, that not off like bad timing, off like they're not perfectly lined up, right? Right. So those guys are coordinated. So if you're going to use something like that, typically those would be panned wide, off to the left and right, because they're obviously were tracked together because they line up and their parts are like perfectly synchronized together. So let's go over here to probably the next important part, which is the pads. Some really loud part over here. A pad is like keyboard pads and things like this. It's kind of like air conditioning in your room. When it first comes on, it's like, okay, you hear it, and then your mind blocks it out after that. And then you don't really notice it until it comes off. And so in things like this, and working with, and there's nothing wrong with that. The idea of a keyboard pad is that it's spelling changes, and it's also creating kind of a foundation from which other percussive elements can sort of emerge from. And so typically this type of thing, like a pad, we're going to want to move it kind of back in the mix, give it a space or an area that's sort of behind other elements, so it acts as like a backdrop, almost like if you were thinking about like a set, for a movie like scene that you're shooting or something like that. This would be part of the set design. It wouldn't be part of something that you would be focusing on. And then there's also a Rhodes part here. This is a part, like when I listen to it, if you really notice it, and here I'm gonna call something up, because this actually might be, it's always a handy tool to have, and then we could just throw this in. Well, let me do two things here. One of the things I'm going to do here is just to put that, just to have a little clipping barrier here for video. We're not anywhere near that, but also give me some control over the gain. And then also I want to have a nice little iZotope Insight plugin. And so what I wanted to focus on here with this is something, and this is where you can actually use some of these elements, like the phase scope. And what you notice here is that there's very little stereo movement and very little stereo information at all. It's a very tight pattern here. To the point where it's practically mono. And that's the way that it sounds. It's like a little bit of reverberant energy which spills off to the sides. But sometimes in mixed situations where maybe you want to save every ounce of CPU power while you're working, then this is a part where you can take it, mono it, basically assign it or take one of the two sides, the left or the right side, because they're essentially identical, and then just process that on its own as a mono instantiation, or a mono track that will save you on CPU power for individual plugins that kind of fall into that. So that plays more of a rhythmic role, right? It's kind of got a funky backbeat part to it. This is classic counter hook lead. So in other words, if you have a lead vocal part, the lead vocal part is primarily driving the main melody and focus of the track. This is an answer. This is like that little voice in the back of your head that's going,
ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting who you are, no stopping, ain't no stopping. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting who you are, stopping, ain't no stopping. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting who you are, no stopping, ain't no stopping. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Realizing.
So that's like in the scheme of a mix like this, those parts are sometimes really important because they kind of have secondary attention. They garner some secondary attention that's more that, like, there's enough movement or enough change or enough melodic movement in there so that it is recognizable. It becomes like a secondary kind of hook. And there's also a part here in the beginning. And this is perfect.
It's enlightening.
Right, so that's a perfect example, like, because this intro, before the vocal comes in, you actually have that part is basically taking over a lead role in the song, and that's carrying you from that introduction where there's nothing except for the kick drum on the floor, and and then there's the guitar part, right, that comes in. So that's kind of carrying you over till you get to that vocal part. So that becomes a really important. So strings and pads. This is a and then there's also another element right here that kind of plays at that same time. So what I would do is I'm going to kind of organize that and move some of these parts together. Okay, so that's important too, because that is also doing a counter melody type of thing. Okay, so that string part is going to be important for that string part to be pretty strong as we're going through the track. The reason there is that acts, that's part of that vintage element, that vibe there. That would be sort of like a classic 70s kind of string arrangement that would wrap around the disco part, the disco beat. Back then, they used to actually use live musicians. This is a sample library. And then the horns. So there's quite a lot of interplay here in the chorus section between what the strings are doing, what that lead synth is doing, the lead vocal singing on top of that, the horns in the background. So there is going to be something that we're going to have to play with and kind of work with orchestrally. It probably is a good idea when you start getting a lot of elements like this, like the synth lead is mono, but probably monoing up the horns and putting them in some other location so that they're not embedded within each other, but they're actually unique and separated from each other. And we can figure that out by the way that it fits into the strings. But that's going to be a really big one in terms of making the rest of this work. So let's listen to what we're at with all of this.
When your legs start to give up on you, still run the race. It's just what we have to do to just claim the fame. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting you are no stopping, ain't no stopping. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting you are no stopping, ain't no stopping. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting you are no stopping, ain't no. We are, ain't no stopping, that's just who we are.
So those background parts play a large role in the song, from the build section all the way up to the choruses. And that's going to be
when your legs start to give up on you,
huge.
Still run the race. Yeah, it's just what we have to do to just claim the fame. That's who we are. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting you are no stopping, ain't no stopping. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting you are no stopping, ain't no stopping. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting you are no stopping, ain't no stopping. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are.
So the whole thing with this and the depth is going to be really, really important to get all of this to work. So in other words, like a big part of this will be creating the front back depth in this mix is going to be huge for making all these different elements work together. Because in the scope of things, when you have a lot of instrumentation like this, the if you pull everything forward, like you can pull everything forward in a punk record because it's basically, you know, two guitars, a bass, drums, and a vocal, right, screaming. And it happens over a short period of time. So you can pull everything right to the front. There's not a lot of instrumentation, and it will sound, you know, have like crazy energy to it. But a track like this, it's so dense with material and elements that are really cool, and you know, but the arrangement is pretty dense. And so as a result, we're going to have to move some instruments back behind things and other things forward and really create that separation so that as you go from section to section, you get some of that movement. Like we're going to want like all the elements, I think, that are going to move to the back, like the strings, that synth lead will be back, probably verbed out a little bit. The horns will kind of be, you know, set back in some location. That's going to be part of the depth thing that opens up the chorus section and makes it sound really big. So, but those are the basic things. Now, for the most part, I haven't heard anything. And as we go through tracks, generally,
It's enlightening
like
who we are.
like you can hear like
Don't have a manual, but together we can use style. We are standing.
So in this is probably caught in a studio, but you can hear the speakers coming through, resonating the glass, going into the booth. So that's more than headphone bleed. There's some headphone bleed there too, but there's also some resonance that's actually coming from the control room bleeding into the vocal mic.
It's enlightening who we are.
You hear
Don't have-
like you hear that little woo, like right there in the beginning of that voice.
It's enlightening who we are. Don't have a manual, but together we can use a start. We are standing just feet apart, not recognizing the reflection of a superstar. When your legs start to give up on you, still run the race. It's just what we have to do to just claim the fame.
So there's a little bit of cleanup work with some of that. You can hear like there's a little bit of a low resonance that's coming from the room. You hear it like really exaggerate in this one area right in the beginning. And a lot of that will be easy to filter out with a high pass filter. And then there's a bit of a sizzle that's almost annoying up on the top. So we kind of manage that, kind of come up with something that's maybe a little bit smoother, or maybe by the time we put all that stuff in. There's also some ad libs. By the time we finish up all the other processing, it may not make a difference. There's also some ad libs here at the end.
Ain't no, yeah. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting who you are.
So
no
these
stopping,
are, this
ain't
is,
no
so we got
stopping.
a distorted part.
Ain't no
Oh, we did.
stopping, no. Trusting who you are, no stopping. Ain't no.
Almost would want to move that to the lead track, as ad libs, and leave that other part there as off, but we can kind of figure that out with some of the organization of the tracks. So the analysis becomes really important because it helps me in my mind to kind of map out where things are, figuring out what things play off of each other, what things are working with each other, and also allows me to, in this analysis, figure out how I want to organize everything. How do I want to, lay out the tracks? What elements or things are going to be next to each other in the mix? What things are complementary or working together all the time? And so part of that section, organization, is part of the next lesson, and that's what we're going to get into right now. So anyway, a little bit of an elongated one with a little bit of the interruption there in the middle, but let's wrap up lesson number 8 and move right along.